welcome everyone to the 4M seminar series. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Gemma Sharp. I'm from the University of Exeter and I lead the 4M consortium with the 4Ms standing for menarche, menstruation, menopause and mental health. This is the 6th seminar in our series and we're very lucky to be joined today by Dr. Katy Marsh Davies from Sheffield Hallam University. Katy is a senior lecturer in organisational behaviour and human resource management, and she's the course lead for the BA Business and Human Resource Management, and she's got lots of other very interesting and varied roles. And today she's going to be presenting the findings of her research that explored the experiences of professional services employees working in a hybrid mode while experiencing the menopause. Audience, please add your questions to the chat as we go, and I'll also give you an opportunity to unmute and ask your questions directly at the end if you prefer that. Katy, if you're ready, I'll pass over to you.
I am. Thanks for the introduction, Gemma, and thanks for inviting me along. Thank you everybody for coming. I'll just take a moment to share my screen because I have some slides just to prompt me and keep me on track today. I'm really passionate about all things menopause. The doctor, by the way, does not mean that I'm a medical professional. I am based in a business school, as Gemma said. So this is the findings, and it's actually the first time that I've presented this outside of my client organisation. So I'm really keen to get feedback from you and take any questions that you might have. So who am I? A little bit more about myself. As Gemma already said, I'm a senior lecturer with Sheffield Business School, which is within Sheffield Hallam University. So as well as all my teaching and course leadership and all those things that we do as academics, I'm also the co-chair of the Hallam Menopause Network, which is primarily a staff network, but we are hoping through our vision in terms of references that we've just established to have impact beyond our organisation as well. So in terms of my research and my external engagement work, my main interest, I suppose, back ages ago was in the umbrella of identity and gender, and it's shifted really in more recent years towards well-being in the workplace and particularly towards menopause. So just to expand a little bit by way of introduction to myself about my research and my external engagement, my doctorate was with University of Sheffield, and it was about home-based working and gender, and it was about the differences that parents would experience when working from home. Now, this was back in 2006, I think was my data collection year. And back then, it was only the really kind of chosen few who were enabled to do this thing that at the time was called home-based teleworking, which is a phrase that I think has almost disappeared by now, just in favour of more straightforward working from home. I'm interested in flexible work, I'm interested in gender, as I say. When COVID came along, I became particularly interested in what it would mean for teachers to work from home for what must be the first time in terms of, full-time teaching from the home sphere. I thought that would be particularly fascinating to explore. My little girl was in preschool at the time. And I think I put this in my blurb about myself. During the pandemic, I was a perimenopausal mother of a preschool child, which had all of the challenges you might expect. So I was interested in menopause because that was from a personal perspective. I was interested in teachers teaching from home because of my child and seeing the sometimes challenges that her teacher was facing to teach this group, or more to the point, teach the parents how to teach the children online. And also I have a lot of teachers in my family as well. So that was really interesting. And through doing that, actually the two worlds collided of menopause and teaching, because I had some off the record conversations with some teachers largely feminized profession. So of course my sample was mainly women, of moments of recognition that we were both reaching for the desk fan, and it wasn't particularly a hot day and that kind of thing. So we had these off the record conversations, and the teachers were telling me that working from home saved their careers, because if they had the symptoms of menopause that they were experiencing, some which were really challenging, they said to me that they would have found it extremely hard if they were still teaching in a physical classroom environment. So that's led to me writing articles about teachers' well-being. It led to me getting commissioned to write a book about teaching post-COVID, which isn't just myself, I should say. I'm the editor of that. So I've pulled together research from about 30 different scholars from across different international settings, and that's forthcoming. Hopefully will be in print in December this year. And I run workshops for local employers about menopause wellbeing, and that's funded through the Sheffield Innovation Programme. Unfortunately, that is EU funding, which now is drying up. So I am looking for another source of funding for those workshops. And the other place that I ran a workshop about menopause and work was with the British Academy of Management, which is a particularly masculine dominated kind of culture. So that was a really proud moment for me to be able to open conversations about menopause in that domain and present it as a management issue. I probably don't need to say this to the people assembled here, but just for completeness, what is menopause? Menopause is when your periods stop, and this happens because of lower hormone levels. There's probably medical professionals in the room who know more about this than I do. So this is just what I've taken from the NHS website. So it usually happens between the ages of 45 and 55. The average age in the UK is 51. But it's always interesting to me to note that across different national settings, the age of menopause onset is different. So it can happen earlier, even just looking at the UK, and that can be just naturally. It can be due to medications. It can be due, for example, to breast cancer treatment. And of course, it can be due to surgery that removes the organs that produce the hormones. Perimenopause is what we call the phase where you start to experience some symptoms of menopause. And once your periods have not been there for a whole 12 months, on that day, you've attained menopause. And after that day, you're then post-menopausal. So I always found that really fascinating that, according to this definition anyway, you literally have just one day where you are menopausal. But really, when I'm talking about menopausal, particularly for the purpose of this study, I'm talking about anyone who's experiencing the symptoms of menopause, and that can be perimenopause, and in some cases it can be once periods have stopped and have been stopped for 12 months and those symptoms are continuing. So that's how I'm defining menopause. Why am I looking at menopause when I'm based in a business school? Well, as I've already alluded to, I think that menopause is a workplace issue, or should be a workplace issue, in that managers need to understand how to look after what is the largest growing demographic, fastest growing demographic in the workforce. 1 in 10 women have left who work during the menopause have left their job due to symptoms, according to a really fantastic piece of research by the Fawcett Society. So if this wets your whistle and you're really interested in menopause in the workplace, that piece of research that was done in the last year is a really flagship piece of research to go to. But I mean, what an awful statistic. So in terms of menopause and work, and this is from the Henpicked website, which again is a really helpful resource for menopause in the workplace. As I said before, menopausal women are the fastest growing demographic in the workforce. 1 in 3 of the workforce will soon be over 50. So of course you have this aging population of workers. And nearly 8 out of 10 menopausal women are in work. 3 out of 4 women experience symptoms of menopause. So there is 1 in 4 who won't experience any symptoms beyond just their periods stopping. But that said, also 1 in 4 could experience really serious symptoms that can be really debilitating. So that brings me to my research, and I'll just do a quick time check there. Yep, okay, I think we're on track. So the aim of my research was to explore experiences of hybrid working during menopause. And the reason this came about was because a particular client came to me and said, we have women who are undertaking hybrid working in our organisation, and we want to be able to do a really comprehensive equalities impact exercise. So I think they'd looked at gender before as a kind of one of the protected characteristics, but they said nothing really came up about menopause, and they wondered if I could come along and talk to women who identified as experiencing menopause whilst hybrid working, so that their experiences could fully be taken into consideration in terms of equality's impact of hybrid working. So the client was a professional services leadership team who are part of a UK higher education institution. So it's the professional services staff that I was looking at here at a UK university. And I offered a variety of methods to try and keep the participation really kind of equitable and attractive for people. So I offered that they could do interviews, they could just send something written. I said that they could perhaps do a listening rooms, which you might be familiar with. That is where 2 or more people, usually who are known to each other, volunteer together to go on an online call and have a chat, and that chat's recorded. There isn't an interviewer present, but they're given some prompts to follow, and then that the recording of that is analysed as data for a study. Of course, I went through an ethical approvals process. So everybody in this sample has a right to anonymity. So all the names that I'm using here, as you'll see with the quotations that I'm providing, there's simply pseudonyms that I've made up. So the client asked for a written report, which obviously I've presented to them, and I've been given permission to do various presentations. Actually, what happened was the client, when I went and spoke to the professional services leadership team, who were the client, I was then kind of signposted to various other places within the university, different committees. So a gender equality steering group, the Athena Swan people. So I've been kind of internally to the client organisation doing a variety of presentations. And as I say, you're the first presentation that I'm doing this to outside of that organisation. So it's great to get a fresh perspective. So the sample ended up being 21 women from this single university's professional services team, these administrators, university administrators. All of them identified themselves as experiencing menopausal symptoms and as hybrid working. It's important to note, though, that 9 of the sample, so getting on for half of them, also had other flexibility in their job, namely that they worked less than full-time hours. So, of course, that can have an impact on their experiences. 11 of them were interviewed, 10 provided written submissions, nobody wanted to do the listening rooms. None of them identified as having a highly physical role. So we are talking here about desk-based administrative workers. So that perhaps suggests that some of this could be generalised with caution to perhaps to other similar roles, but probably shouldn't be generalised to people who work in a more physical role. And where stated, the age range of my participants was between 42 and 56. So I went into this with a few speculations, and this is based on my prior research and my trying to keep up to date with all the literature that there is on this topic, which of course has grown a lot since COVID, and the enforced home working that entailed for many people. So I speculated that home-based work, which of course is one component of hybrid working, might help women to control their workspaces and have home comforts. And by that I was thinking, you know, close to their own wardrobe if they felt they needed to change into cooler clothes, have their desk fans, be able to use their own toilets. But I was worried that it could remove vital sources of social support and impact on the visibility of women of a certain age, for want of a better phrase, in the workplace and generally in society. I was worried that when these women were hot desking, which in this sample they were, when they were on campus in offices, they didn't have a dedicated space. They had to hot desk. I worried that that could make control of their workspaces difficult and access to those helpful measures, those home comforts, difficult. And they could make symptoms difficult to mask if they felt they wanted to be a bit more discreet about their symptoms. And I was worried as well that hot desking could result in a loss of support and community being apart from their physical teams. And in terms of flexibility, my speculation was that having choice over where to work could really help women in managing the symptoms of menopause. So speaking of the symptoms of menopause, again, apologies for anyone who is already an expert in menopause. The way I like to categorize these is in terms of the menstrual symptoms, the other physical symptoms, cognitive processing and memory symptoms, and then the emotional and mental health symptoms. And I use this as a framework when I was asking participants about their symptoms. But just again to say, 1 in 4 of women in the broader population might not experience any symptoms beyond their periods stopping. And I always say that because in one of my earlier talks about menopause, there was a young woman in the room and she was horrified and she was saying, oh my God, I've just come out of all the challenges of maternity and, you know, fighting for my rights around that and being taken seriously. And now I've got this to come. So I always like to say, this isn't everybody. However, in this sample, all of the women did say they were experiencing some symptoms. So I sought to explore what those symptoms were and what the impacts of them were and how they related to their experiences of hybrid working. So in terms of menstrual symptoms, again, just to remind you, these are not the real names of the participants. Lou talked about the unpredictability of her periods approaching menopause, just haven't got a clue, can't be prepared for it. And Christine talks about really painful periods. It's like your insides are dropping out. And also, what was quite an interesting quote from Christine is that I think she hadn't realised that when menopause comes along, you might still have your periods and you'll be experiencing symptoms. So she says, I've all the symptoms of menopause, but I've still got the periods, and that's just not fair. Other physical symptoms reported by these 21 women in my sample were urinary symptoms, so increases in UTIs, but also urinary incontinence, bowel issues, hair, skin and nail not being of the same quality. A lot of women in this sample reported migraines as well, and also vertigo and sensory issues. They reported joint pain and stiffness. They attributed weight gain to menopause as well, which may simply be indirect. I'm not a medical person. They talked about allergies suddenly going through the roof as well. So hay fever suddenly being crazy, suddenly having new food allergies, suddenly having new sensitivities to certain things as well. And they also talked about teeth and oral symptoms like burning gums and a burning tongue, having to see their dentist more often as well. And anyone who has tried to look up the symptoms of menopause online, you will indeed find that the lists almost are endless. I've seen lists with about 60 different symptoms on. I think the one on the NHS has perhaps more so about 30, but wherever you look, there's kind of a variety, a real cocktail of the symptoms that you can experience during menopause. So probably the most well-known, perhaps the stereotypical symptom of menopause is the hot flush, or hot flash, as they say in America. So Tracy articulates this really well. She says it's like it's coming from inside and you're like a nuclear bomb and then just the red hot coming out. And she talks about not being able to plan for this and gives one really interesting example where she says she had an experience of a hot flush when she was parking her car, and she then had to go into her office. So this is actually pre-COVID. She was just giving me an example of what hot flushes were like for her. And she says that she was dripping with sweat, her hair was stuck to her face, and it really knocked her confidence. So this was just a really good example, by way of introduction, to the impacts of menopause in the workplace. It's a really good example of how a physical symptom then can lead to, for example, here, a loss of confidence. And the cognitive processing and memory symptoms were reported a lot. Nearly all the sample reported brain fog, for example. So here's Lou talking about memory issues. She talks about she used to have really good recollection for names, and now suddenly she can't remember names. It literally went overnight, she says. And she thought, is this early onset dementia or something? Which I know is a really common response from women. And I think Davina McCall, the kind of perhaps most famous celebrity who talks a lot about menopause now, I think that was her experience too. And the brain fog, here's a quote from Anne who says, sometimes I can be a little bit foggy at work. I can't pull the word out. I don't feel I'm working as fast as I could. So lots of other emotional and mental health symptoms, unfortunately, reported by the sample: anxiety, stress, low mood, tearfulness, sensitivity, irritability and rage as well, and generally having a lack of drive, a lack of energy, for example, for socializing, and a sense of being overwhelmed and of losing confidence. And then cutting across all this, I kind of created an extra category here for this presentation, was the issue of sleep, but also the issue of fatigue. So these actually being two separate things. So here, Becca represents sleeplessness, and she talks about when you don't have a good night's sleep, it's even choosing what you want for lunch becomes traumatic. And then on the other hand, we have Christine, who says, I must admit I do sleep okay, but I'm tired all the time. So she talks about getting up to 11 hours sleep, but still being really tired. And Anne represents the thing about the symptoms that the thing was echoed across different women in this sample. She says the thing is, it's not all the time. That's what I find strange. Some days I'm like this, some days I'm not, some days I'm like that. So she just represents really the fact that menopause symptoms can be really variable and really unpredictable, which of course makes it really hard for the women themselves, but also for anyone who's trying to manage these women or work alongside them. So the women did do a lot of things themselves, and just for reason of time, I won't go through all of these. But as you can see, the women were doing lots of things to try and look after themselves. But also a real common theme was represented by Jen, who says, you know, with a full-time job, with a family, with a house to run, you put yourself bottom at least, don't you? So there was a kind of a theme of self-sacrifice here. And again, just lots of other things that people did. A really common theme was that using social media, using the internet to inform yourself, to build networks and that kind of thing. So speaking of which, I asked them what seemed to be helpful as women experiencing menopause whilst hybrid working. And the theme of networks and social support came up. So we had Lou, who talked about amongst her colleagues, we have lots of conversations about menopause and symptoms and getting that emotional support. Having people saying, yes, I get you, I know where you're coming from, she found helpful. She also actually is the one who reflected on the fact that at this institution, they have like in Hallam, a staff menopause network, and they said it's great, it's very open, honest conversations. There's a really good group of women supporting each other and validating each other. Another thing that seemed to be helpful to these women were having really flexible and managers who understand symptoms of menopause and the nature of those. And this wasn't just other females. So this is Anne, who's talking about her male manager, for example, who seems to be very understanding, gives her a bit of time out if she needs it. And what Anne reports at the end of this is she says if they allow that bit of flexibility, it comes back to them twofold. So she reports that her and her colleagues will reciprocate in terms of being more flexible, perhaps when there's peaks of work, for example. Another thing, very much talking about having a culture of openness about menopause and feeling that their struggles with symptoms is validated. So some of the language that's used is represented here in these quotes, where Lou's talking about normalising talk about menopause, that it being very validating, and Becca even says that it's quite empowering to be able to talk about it. Other things in terms of what women found helpful at work, sitting near a window so they could control, for example, the light and the airflow, the fresh air, having a special chair if they had bad back, other equipment for bad wrists as well were mentioned, making lots of notes. Some women talked about it being really hard to keep up with online training, and so they found that if they worked together to create training guides for themselves, that was helpful. Having scripts and other memory aids and other tools to keep them organised, they found really helpful. So just a bit more on the impact of menopause in the workplace then. This is a case from Emma, and she talks about having taken a secondment to a position that's a promotion for her, and found that because of her menopause symptoms, unfortunately, she had to give that up and took a pay cut and a drop in the career structure because of menopause symptoms. She says, I could have done without that 10 grand pay cut now with the cost of living. I do feel it stunted my career a bit because I lost all my confidence due to the low mood, the anxiety, the brain fog, and I have quite a lot of migraines, and I resigned. She says, I'd never have gone off sick. I'd rather be fair to colleagues than say, look, someone else can do this. So that was quite a distressing case to hear about. And other people reporting loss of confidence, damage to reputation or perceived damage to reputation. And Tracy here reflects on the fact that she doesn't really want to divulge that she's struggling with menopause because she doesn't want that to reflect on her, I suppose, professional identity. So when it comes to home working, that part of hybrid working, there were a lot of positives listed. And to be fair, a lot of the ones listed on this slide are probably common regardless of whether you're experiencing menopause. So responsibilities, seeing more of family, doing chores, being there for shopping deliveries, getting out and walking our dogs, going for a run, not having the stress of the commute, having autonomy, particularly over working spaces, how, when, what work you do next. A lot reported being able to concentrate more and felt that their work was improved in the home space, and talked about being able to have a rest, have a nap, have a bit of peaceful time. And also, this was a female-only sample. They talked about not needing to do makeup, being able to wear comfortable clothes. And then things that I felt were particularly about menopause, positives of menopause and hybrid working. And this kind of did bear out some of the assumptions I made before I undertook the research. Being closer to your own toilet, being closer to your own clothes, to change into in case you have bladder incontinence or heavy bleeding, flooding. Being able to turn off your camera if you're feeling sweaty or hot. Managing the light, the fresh air, the temperature, And also, some of the women reported that they liked working from home because they felt they managed to get a pause in between meetings to gather their thoughts and to make notes. I have, however, had other people, when I've presented this, who said, oh no, it's back-to-back meetings. It's even worse than if you were in the office. So I'm sure other perspectives are available on that one. The challenges of home-based work, again, reflected a lot of the stuff that I'd assumed before undertaking the study. So a loss of connection to others was reported, a loss of ability to build relationships, poor decision-making, loss of being able to learn from others. And then people talked a bit about technical issues, worry of losing power, the price of heating and electricity, and also not having space within the home environment. For example, if you were gifted a really wonderful chair that supported your back and was adjustable and all those things for joint pain, and that was in your office on campus, and if you didn't have the space in the home sphere, then that was problematic. Some also reported being distracted by the home environment, so family and chores and things. Some reported finding it hard having too much screen time, and that was particularly the people who were suffering more headaches and migraines. And some people also said that being on campus and in the office environment was really energizing, and that they missed out on that and felt that when they were at home, sometimes they'd have a lack of drive, a lack of motivation. Excuse me. So when we're talking about the other side of hybrid working, which is when you're back on campus, and usually hot desking for this sample of women, they said, as reflected in the quote I gave earlier, that it can be really hard, perhaps embarrassing, having to face others during or after a hot flush. And I know others also said facing others whilst you're having a memory issue, brain fog, trying to pull out the word, and worried about looking unprofessional for that. Other visible symptoms, such as having to go to the toilet a lot, using fans, trying to control the temperature, particularly in a communal office, and particularly where you don't know other people, and that was raised as a challenge. And the challenge of going into the office to try and get that social support, that social environment, and finding that nobody else had come in. This is what some of the sample were telling us. And the challenges specifically of hot desking, the sample did not like hot desking as an aspect of their hybrid work. And I know it's not an aspect of everybody's hybrid work. Sometimes you do have a base, an anchor, which is the language that these ladies talked about. Having a base, having an anchor is what they would have preferred, they said, but hot desking took that from them. And also then having to lug around the laptop in a rucksack, and then that's knocking onto the joint pain that they might have been suffering as well. So they were reported as challenges of hot desking. So coming towards the end of my slides then, just wanted to summarise what the key findings were of the study. And the main finding is that overall the participants found hybrid working during menopause was beneficial. There wasn't one of them who said, no, I don't want it, I didn't want it, and you can get rid of it tomorrow. They all said in some ways that that hybrid working during menopause was beneficial. So Anne, for example, get up in the morning, see how you feel, and if you're feeling awful, you can decide not to go to campus, not having to go on public transport, not having the stress of being late and having to carry stuff around. Christine, thank you, darling. Sorry, it's my little girl coming in from school. Christine here is talking about if she had to be in the office, then she thinks she'd have a lot more time off sick. The other key finding is that doing hybrid working is not so helpful where the women themselves aren't in control of it. So when there's a lack of flexibility, and Christine here said, for example, it's hybrid, but it's hybrid on the basis of the university telling you when you can and can't work from home and from on campus. So she felt that her personal experience lacked that autonomy. So that, of course, filters to the kind of recommendations, the recommendations that I presented to the client. So what could be really helpful for women in menopause when hybrid working, where possible, to give that control back to the women, to be flexible with which days they needed to be on campus, which days they can be at home. And the other thing, and this is something I wasn't kind of expecting really, because a large proportion of my sample worked part-time, participants kept kind of saying, well, I don't know whether that's a benefit for hybrid working or whether it's more because I work part-time. So particularly around being able to get a good work-life balance, they talked about that. So Charlotte here sums that up nicely. And what I recommended to the client in this way was to make sure that more opportunities to work flexibly in other ways, such as part-time, were promoted alongside hybrid working for women who seem to be struggling with menopausal symptoms. But of course, that can lead to detrimental impacts on your career, missing out on, well, clearly you've got a hit in terms of immediate salary, but you also get a hit in terms of your pensions contributions. And as I say, it can mean that career progression can be more difficult if you're not working full time. So the recommendation was that flexible ways of working should be used as temporary measures to support women through menopause, which of course is a temporary phase of life, and will not be around forever for the individuals. Another thing about what could be helpful was looking at spaces that could be helpful, having a personal locker or shelf for equipment, change of clothes, a quiet space or place to go. And one of the participants, Joyce, talked about, I don't know if we might call it the menopause room. I don't know how many people would feel comfortable walking under a big sign that said menopause room this way. So she kind of laughed at herself for kind of saying that it could be labelled that. But actually what I've done since this is I've asked the client to make really clear across the university and through their staff network a list of all the respite rooms and of course shower facilities and changing spaces as well, and that women in menopause could go to if they felt they needed to. One person in the sample raised an issue over gender neutral toilets, just saying here, I don't mind sharing bathrooms with male colleagues, but I do want the option of a sanitary bin for her period products. Other things that could be helpful, even more awareness to be raised about menopause, not just the kind of the stereotypes of what menopause is, but also the real breadth of symptoms and the nature of the symptoms being unpredictable, and that these are short term. All of those things came across, and really this client organisation could do a little bit more work around that. And including that within managers' induction and training was the recommendation that I made. You might recall I talked about some women not keeping up with online training and then having to create their own training guides for their team. Of course, that's additional labour for those women. So if training just was made a bit more inclusive to account for people who might need to make notes or be shown things in person, then that would be beneficial, not just for women in menopause, but across other groups as well. I'm thinking of kind of neurodivergent people too here. And I think that's it. Gosh, I've sped to the end there. I hope you found that interesting. I'm really keen to take any questions from you. Do keep in touch beyond today. You can either email me, which my email address is there on the screen, or follow me on Twitter. I am @KatyAcademic, and I post, the updates about publications and presentations and things. So perhaps our paths will cross again. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katy. It's really, really interesting. Has anyone got any questions? As I say, feel free to put them in the chat or put your hand up, and I'll ask you to unmute. While we're waiting for other questions to filter through, I've got a few. So let's see. Well, one thing I wondered was you talked about kind of generalizability to other kind of sedentary jobs. I wondered whether you thought there would be whether it would be possible to generalize from these professional services staff working at university to the academic staff as well.
Yeah, good question. I was asked that before. I was asked particularly by the client, oh, can we share these with the academic staff and people leading those votes? And I suppose you can take from it what you will. Obviously, the academic role demands some particular time that needs to be on campus for classroom-based activity. So in that sense, it's perhaps more student-facing. But what I think is really important to note is that the professional services team in this university, as in many other universities, also is really diverse. So in that team, there'll probably be some people who are doing much more comparable jobs with academics. So maybe, for example, careers advisors who were counted in this professional services team, and people who were on the student help desks and things. So perhaps with some of those participants, some of those findings would be generalizable to academics because it's a kind of more comparable role. But then again, with the academic folks, you've got some who sit at a desk and do research all the time. You've got others who are in sports and exercise, and they're up and about on their feet all the time. So yeah, it was quite a diverse sample, and there may be aspects of that could relate to academics. I think, in short, would be my response there.
Yeah, I mean, from your findings, it seems likely, I think. So yeah, so Jane just said thank you very much, really interesting. I did have another question. So one thing was about COVID. So this was during COVID, was it?
No, this is a hybrid work pilot, still ongoing as a pilot, that came out of COVID. So during COVID, obviously, most of these colleagues were in that university were based at home, and the university were kind of debating, well, shall we continue it, or shall we try and get some kind of mix so that we get the benefits of working from home, but we also have capacity back on campus and the cultural side of our work, and energized, reinvigorated campus. So they were kind of the impetus for it came out of COVID. But this data collection period actually was like 6 months ago, so it's since COVID.
Yeah, okay, great, fine. Yeah, I was just wondering whether COVID had come up as a sort of theme, just from some of my own work where I've done a bit on experience of menstrual symptoms after COVID infection, and I just wondered whether sort of menopausal symptoms had also been affected by actual COVID infection. But six months ago, people probably not thinking about COVID as much as we were 3 years ago.
You're right. I think the only mentions of COVID were in relation to, that's when I started working from home and found it was beneficial to me.
Okay, yeah, great. And then so one question I had, which you kind of touched on at the end there, regarding how adjustments in the workplace. So I wondered what your thoughts were, considering your kind of expertise and background in this work that you've done. on menopause leave, because that's something that has come up a few times in our discussions in forum, and also around menstrual leave as well, as a sort of separate thing from sick leave. And I just wondered what your kind of thoughts were on that.
From my workshops, I have come across a couple of organisations now who are using a different reporting for menopause absences rather than sick leave. So I know that it is kind of taking on some organisations are beginning to do that. I personally advocate for a range of flexible options and for genuine flexibility where the control is with the women themselves. So it might be that part-time is the way to go for some women for some of the time, or even indeed for some women for all of the time. It might be that menopause leave is the right thing to do for some women, particularly if they're having really debilitating symptoms and just finding that their interface with work is so wretched that it would be in their own interests not to be present in work through particularly challenging times of menopause. So I would absolutely advocate for it, but as a package of measures that a woman is able, if you like, to cherry pick from to suit what she's going through at any particular stage in her menopause journey.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting what came up at the end there around autonomy and having that kind of true flexibility. And when
I've reported this, and I've reported it not just to the leaders but also to a broader group in that institution, they've actually been really generous in saying, we do know that there are some things that are business critical. We do know that it's helpful to build a culture. So they're, very kind of informed and generous in their approach to this. So they're not saying, oh yeah, I want to pick and choose and, sod the rest and the business and all those things. And these people genuinely have a passion for students as well. So that they are really realistic about where there might be constraints on them having that choice and flexibility. But then they can also see the flip side where there really doesn't seem to be any rationale for them being dragged to campus for a full day on a certain day of the week every week. And it's I think a lot is in the gift of the line manager in terms of how to interpret perhaps diktats that have been passed down from higher up in the leadership team.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let me see, I've got so many, I'm just finding the more interesting ones. One thing is you spoke a bit about the positive effects or the positive aspects of hybrid working for managing menopause symptoms, but I wondered if through your interviews anything had come up around the sort of positive experiences of the menopause in general, because it's very, as you said, it's very like, oh, the menopause is awful and all these terrible symptoms happen. I just wondered if anybody had sort of drawn upon anything positive.
Yeah, so first thing to say, of course, these are self-selecting women who say, yes, I am experiencing menopause symptoms, and so you probably would expect that they're largely wanting to tell you all about all the challenges and things. But there were people who talked about almost finding a new sense of camaraderie and community, and finding that through shared experience with other colleagues, with other women, both within their department and across the wider university through a staff network that they had there. So they were the positive things that were spoken about. I do know that there are some women who are really positive about menopause and find it as a real coming of age thing and of a moment of wisdom and self-acceptance and all those things. I've come across those in different studies and just generally through life, and talking about menopause, you know, at the bus stop and in the supermarket queue and everywhere else where people want to talk about it with me. But yeah, in this sample, I'd say the positivity was limited to what I've just reported, because these were women who were self-selecting as, if you like, struggling with symptoms of menopause during hard working.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay, great. Well, if there aren't any questions from anyone else, which I don't think there are, then I'll just say thank you very much, Katy, for talking to us today. That was really, really interesting. And as usual, the recording will be available online. I had a few people email to say that they couldn't make it, but they were really looking forward to seeing the recording. And yeah, we'll be back in July with another forum seminar. And yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Gemma. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.